Very glad to be here. Thank you, Johannes, for putting all of this together. I'm going to screen share. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a paper which is co-authored with Sumit Agarwal, Sufala Chumsessenfat, and none other than Johannes Strobel that we wrote and managed to publish a couple of years ago. But we are still, I think, very excited about. And the big picture motivation is in response to the Great Recession, and we've also seen this actually in response to COVID, a key policy objective was to provide banks with lower cost capital and liquidity. I think the idea is very straightforward. You provide banks with cheaper money. They go out and expand credit to households and businesses who borrow, spend, and invest and stimulate the economy. What's challenging, though I think it's fairly obvious that this mechanism works to some extent in practice, I think it's challenging to quantify it using what would be the most natural approach, which is time series evidence, because changes in the cost of borrowing for banks, reductions in the federal funds rate or in other sort of central bank rates around the world occur precisely when the economy is falling apart. And so separating or identifying causal effects is challenging. So what we're going to do in this paper is propose sort of a new approach to studying this channel, which can be implemented using microdata, which is the subject, I guess, of this week's lectures, and quasi-exogenous cross-sectional variation, the types of RDs that Chris was showing you in the auto loans context. And we're going to use this to study credit card lending during the Great Recession. Credit cards are a marginal source of credit for most households, so we think they're sort of independently interesting, but this is also going to be a great laboratory for us thinking about the types of frictions that exist in the bank lending channel more generally. All right, so at a high level, I think our approach is going to be summarized in this slide. So the credit card market, I think like many lending markets, clears on quantities and less so on prices. So here it's clearing or it's adjusting on credit limits. So you can think about the impact of a decrease in the cost of funds, that's little c, on overall borrowing, little q, as the product of two terms. One is what's the effect of this decrease in the cost of funds on credit limits. So this is what we call the marginal propensity to lend, that's that first term. And then it's going to be that multiplied by what's the effect of that increase in lending on borrowing. So that's the DQ, DCL, that's the marginal propensity to borrow. So you take the product over that for each individual, you integrate it over all individuals in the economy, and that is sort of the full effect of this channel. And so this decomposition we think is very useful. It's going to be empirically useful because I'm going to show you that we can use the types of research designs, in this case it's going to be RDs, which are the bread and butter of sort of applied microeconomics to estimate each of these objects. Right? So we're going to not need that time series. We're not going to need exogenous time series variation in the federal funds rate. And then I think it's going to be conceptually useful because it's going to allow us to unpack what's going on at an aggregate level into both supply and demand and to look at heterogeneity in supply and demand across different people. Right? And so that is sort of why we think this is a useful lens. And what we're going to do is basically just estimate heterogeneous NPBs and NPLs in the US credit card market over our time period. So a quick summary before I get into some of the details. So we have pretty awesome data. So data on the universal credit card accounts issued by the 8 largest US banks. Our research design, which I will show you much more information on, is going to use the fact that credit limits are often set as a step function of FICO scores. It's going to give us 743 credit limit regression discontinuities. I'm going to use these to estimate heterogeneous marginal propensities to borrow. And perhaps not surprisingly, you're going to find that the people who are most responsive to an increase in their credit limit are low FICO score people. Right? So people who sort of are at the bottom of the FICO score distribution, we think are generally lower income or have problematic credit histories. I'm then going to show you to think about the supply side. We're going to use a model. And the model is going to say that the optimal response of a bank to a change in their cost of funds is going to depend upon simple sufficient statistics that I'm going to argue we can estimate in a transparent way in our data. I'm then going to put these two things together, and I'm going to argue that basically banks want to extend credit the most to people who want to borrow the least, so that there's going to be this mismatch between the marginal propensity to borrow and marginal propensity to lend in the population. All right. So, like I said, it's pretty great data. So it is data on all credit cards issued by the 8 largest US banks, about 400 million credit card accounts, monthly over a 7-year period. And we're going to see, I think, sort of most of what you want to see. We'll see spending and borrowing information, which is going to allow us to estimate the marginal propensity to borrow. And then we're going to see things which feed into banks' profits. So the interest payments, the fees, how much they lose, how much they charge off because people default. And that's going to fit into our supply side model and give us the marginal propensities to lend. We're also going to have merged in credit bureau information so that while our core focus is on that specific card, we're going to look at whether the action on that card is being offset by action elsewhere in the portfolio. And our main sample restriction, we're going to be looking at our research design is using credit card origination. So we'll focus on credit cards originated during our sample period. All right, so the research design, and as I hinted at, it's using credit limit quasi-experiments. So credit card lenders and most lenders in the US set both prices and quantities based upon, often on FICO scores. They may also consider other internal factors, but FICO scores tend to be the primary way that credit is priced. So this graph shows you the relationship between the average credit limit and FICO score for a certain bank originating a certain type of credit card in a given month. And you can see there's this monotonic upward sloping relationship. If you have a better FICO score, you have more access to credit. This next graph shows you this same relationship at a bank for a type of product where credit limits are set as a step function of FICO scores. And so we're plotting the average credit limits here in the data. You can see basically as your credit score hits 720, the credit limit you would get if you originate a card jumps by $2,500. As your credit score hits 760, again, you have a similar size jump. And so these are going to be the regression discontinuities that we're going to use in our research design. And as I'm going to argue, showing you a number of pieces of evidence, like if we believe that the creditworthiness, the propensity to borrow of people to the left and the right of these discontinuities is trending smoothly, we can control for that with flexible polynomials, and then we have a quasi-experiment exactly where those credit limits increase. So before I show you that evidence of validity, just a little bit about the quasi-experiments in our data. We identify 743 of these experiments. There's about 8.5 million accounts within 50 FICO points of our experiments. That's going to be our primary analysis sample. And those experiments are distributed, you can see here in this graph, in a similar proportion to basically the distribution of credit cards in the population. So we're going to see them across the credit score distribution, obviously more in the middle where more people are, but it is going to cover the range. Okay, so what is our RD estimator? Well, without going through, I think, the math, it is basically for a given outcome. So let's say we're interested in the jump in borrowing. We're going to look at the jump in borrowing at the sort of regression discontinuity divided by the jump in credit limit. And so to be able to interpret that as the causal effect of providing a higher credit limit, two things are going to have to be true. One is other contract and borrow characteristics are going to have to trend smoothly. And the other thing is there can't be any strategic movement around the cutoff. So let me talk about both of those in turn. So before doing that, actually, let me show you there's a first stage here. So I showed you those jumps at one bank for one product in one time period. Here is the average jump across all of the experiments in our data. And you can see at the discontinuity, there's something like a $1,500 jump in credit limits, smooth trends in credit limits to the left and to the right. Right. So here's the first thing. We want to know that other card characteristics trend smoothly. If they jumped as well, of course, we'd be estimating the effect of a bunch of different contract characteristics. And interest rates trend smoothly here. Institutionally, I think the reason is because banks are using slightly different models to determine access to credit and the price of credit. So this is not surprising to us given sort of our institutional knowledge. Here's some other borrow characteristics that trend smoothly, age of oldest account, number of other credit card accounts, and so on and so forth. More on this in the paper. The final thing is, and you see a lot of this, I think, in labor economics, is being sure that there's no bunching on one side of the discontinuity. And so, if people, let's think about a hypothetical, if people knew exactly what a bank's credit score formula was and could precisely control when they apply for a card, you might see bunching. But I think both of those conditions are highly unlikely to be true in the real world. There's only some discontinuities across all the banks and all the time periods. It's hard to know where these are. And it's hard for people to precisely control their FICO score. They might know roughly what it is, but to be able to control it to a small number of FICO score points, I think is highly unlikely. And that's why in the data you don't see any bunching. Right? So it seems like what we have here are valid experiments. Okay, so have all these experiments, what we're going to do is estimate treatment effects for a given outcome across all 743 experiments. And then we don't want to show you 743 estimates, we want to combine them together. And our key interest here is basically heterogeneity in the MPBs and MPLs. And so we're going to combine effects together by taking the 743 data points and regressing them on FICO score, basically quartiles. So that's just going to capture average effects for the bottom, and higher quartiles of the FICO score distribution. And then we're going to control in our baseline specifications for fully interactive bank by origination quarter fixed effects. So that's going to mean that any differences we estimate are basically looking within, let's say, Bank of America in June 2010, what's the difference in the responsiveness? What's the difference in the treatment effects between the lowest FICO score quartile and the second lowest, and so on and so forth. All right. Checking the time. Great. So now that I've built some machinery, let's take it to the data. So first, here's the average marginal propensity to borrow at the discontinuity. If you remember, there was about a $1,500 increase in credit limits. This is showing you that on average, there's something like a $500 increase in borrowing, right, trending smoothly on either side. So people are responding to higher credit limits. I think what we think is most interesting is the heterogeneity. So this showed you the effect at 12 months. This plot is showing you these marginal propensities to borrow at different time horizons after origination. So that's on the x-axis, and for these 4 different credit score quartiles. And so what you see, and what I hinted to in the beginning, is the marginal propensity to borrow for the lowest FICO score quartile is about 1/2. You give someone an additional $1,000 in credit limit, they borrow $500 more. It's decreasing monotonically as you move up the FICO score distribution, and here it's 15% or something like that for the highest FICO score groups. So these are MPBs on the treated card, the card that experienced a higher increase in credit limits. Like I said, we also have credit bureau data, so we can actually look across someone's entire portfolio. These estimates are a little bit noisy now because we're estimating effects, on 4 to 7 cards that someone has. But they show, I think, a similar pattern with one exception. So the way in which this picture is very similar is the highest FICO score group, or the lowest FICO score group, sorry, has a marginal propensity to borrow, again, of around 1/2, maybe a little bit higher than 1/2. What's a little bit, it's decreasing monotonically as you get to higher FICO scores. The way it's a little bit different is that the highest FICO score group, there doesn't seem like there's any increase in overall borrowing. So that is consistent with, 1-for-1 offset. You give them a higher credit limit on one card, they borrow more on that card, only a little bit more, 15% more, but that's offset by reduced borrowing on other products. Okay, so what's the takeaway? Substantial heterogeneity, low FICO score people, they borrow a lot. Marginal propensity to borrow 50%, not offset, corresponds to increase in spending on the treated card. I didn't show you those, that's in the paper. Highest FICO score, small effect on the treated card, seems like it's being completely offset by less borrowing on other cards. Okay, so zooming back to that big picture question, we said, how do we stimulate borrowing? What's the strength of the bank lending channel? This tells us that if you want to get consumers to borrow and spend more, you're going to need to get money to low FICO score households. Those are the people who will actually respond to changes in access to credit. Okay, which of course raises the question, do banks want to lend more to these people? So how are we going to get at that? So firstly, how are we defining the marginal propensity to lend? It's going to be the effect on credit limits of a 1 percentage point permanent reduction in the cost of funds. So like we said, it's hard to estimate using an event study approach because changes in the federal funds rate occur when lots of other things are happening. So we're going to use a model-based approach which builds on sufficient statistics that we can directly estimate. So we're making a trade-off here. We're saying to overcome the identification challenge, we are going to write down a model. It's going to be one of the simplest models, I think, that you've seen in a long time, but it is going to require some assumptions that banks behave optimally, that we can measure the sufficient statistics that go into that model. Okay, so here's the model. So looking at setting an optimal credit limit, think about for a group of observably identical borrowers. So Q of CL is the quantity of borrowing. It's a function of the credit limit. F of CL is fee revenue, C of CL is net charge-offs. There R is the exogenously determined interest rate, and C is the cost of funds. The bank's objective function is to maximize profits, which this is the quantity of borrowing. This is the spread between the interest rate and the cost of funds. So this is basically net interest charge revenue. Then they get some fee revenue, and they lose some money because of charge-offs. That's the objective function. So how do we figure out what's the optimal credit limit? We take the first order condition and we set it equal to 0. Doing so, intuitively, the optimal credit limit is the credit limit such that the marginal revenue for a $1 increase in the credit limit equals the marginal cost. Or at the margin, marginal profits, the effective increase in credit limit by $1 doesn't change profits. So that's the first order condition. Now let's think about the marginal propensity to lend. So how lending changes with a change in the cost of funds. Right? That's that object here. And we can recover that by applying the implicit function theorem to the first order conditions. So if we do that, we get this object. And rather than going through the math, let me try and show you what's going on in this object with some figures. So the marginal propensity to lend depends upon the difference between the slope of marginal revenue, so this is marginal revenue and this is a derivative, the slope of marginal costs, all scaled by the marginal propensity to borrow. Why does the slope, for example, of marginal cost matter? Well, think about these two graphs here have the same marginal revenue curves. This one on the left has a flat marginal cost curve. This one on the right has a steep marginal cost curve. So now think about a decrease, a 1 percentage point decrease in the cost of funds. These are decreases in this curve of equal amounts. When marginal cost has a flat slope, right? So this number is low. If you decrease marginal costs, the optimum, which sets marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, right? shifts out by a lot. If, on the other hand, the slope of marginal cost is steep, then the new optimum shifts out by a little bit. Intuitively, what's going on, if marginal costs are steeply upward sloping, it means that as you expand access to credit, you're generating higher costs for yourself, for reasons that we'll talk about in the next slide. And so if you have lower costs, you don't want to go too far up that slope. Whereas if marginal costs are flat, then if you have lower costs, you want to expand credit a lot because you're not running into higher costs by doing so. So what are things which affect the slope of marginal costs? Well, it's exactly the things that we think are sort of first order in lending markets, which are basically moral hazard and adverse selection. So adverse selection leads to higher, more steeply sloping marginal costs. If you increase access to lending, and the people who borrow in response to that are people who are more likely to default, that's adverse selection. That manifests in the data by more steeply upward sloping marginal costs. Similarly, right, what some people call moral hazard, if you increase access to credit, that leads people to have higher debt amounts, which makes them more likely to default, right? Either because they're strategic, so pure moral hazard, or maybe myopia, they just borrow as much as they can and they realize they can't pay it back. That again is just going to lead to that upward sloping relationship. More access to credit, higher costs. And so what our model is doing, the slope of marginal cost parameterizes the importance of these factors without us having to specify exactly one channel through which these effects occur. Right. So how are we going to estimate these slopes, marginal costs, also marginal revenue in the data? So we're going to estimate them using the same experiments we use to estimate the marginal propensity to borrow, but slightly different outcome data. So each experiment delivers two moments for us. We can see marginal cost of the prevailing credit limit, right? That's just the effect of an increase in credit limits on costs, so charge-offs. We can also see average costs per dollar at the credit limit. So those two data points, right, for each experiment allow us to estimate a slope. So in our baseline specification, we're just going to have marginal costs being upward sloping, and that's going to then allow us to estimate the marginal propensity to lend. Great. So now let me show you some estimates. So let me start by showing you marginal profits. This is at 48 months. So cumulatively over 4 years after originating the card. So if banks had set credit limits which ended up being ex post optimal, on the margin, we said our first order condition is that marginal profits should be 0. Well, you know, it's hard to predict things 4 years in advance, but these are pretty damn close to 0. Maybe banks slightly overextended credit to people in the middle of the distribution. Remember, this is during the financial crisis. So maybe hard to get things ex ante perfect, but pretty close. What about the slope of marginal profits? So that's going to be the slope of marginal revenue minus the slope of marginal costs identified by our credit limit experiments. What you see here is that marginal profit is steeply, basically downward sloping for the lowest FICO score people. What's going on here? This is driven by steeply upward sloping marginal costs. As you provide more credit to the bottom of the distribution, they're more likely to default. And so that means that the cost of providing them more credit is higher. So marginal profits are more steeply downward sloping. As you go to higher FICO score groups, the slope of marginal profit is less steep. So this is now just showing you the equation you've seen before, the marginal propensity to lend, which is this MPP divided by the slope of marginal profits. And so if you take those estimates and you plug them into this equation, you find that the marginal propensity to lend out of $1 increase in credit limits is, has this inverse relationship, that for $1 increase in credit limits, you want to expand, or sorry, a 1 percentage point decrease in the cost of funds, you want to expand credit limits by about $1,000 for the top of the distribution, but only $200 for the bottom of the distribution. Right? So put now the NPLs and the NPVs together, and you have this mismatch. That the people who are going to respond the most to a change in credit limits are those with the lowest credit limits, but those are the people who banks want to lend to the least. So one way to think about the degree of this mismatch is, suppose you just calculated basically the overall effect, ignoring the heterogeneity, you would get twice the pass-through as if you account for this negative correlation between NPV and NPL. Great. So I am just about going to finish on time. So what we tried to sort of communicate to you in this paper, I realized I was going pretty fast. So hopefully this was just an appetizer to actually read what we do, is to propose a new framework to estimate the strength of this bank lending channel, which rather than using time series evidence, uses this sort of micro RD variation, which we think is more credible. This complements other approaches. And then we applied this to the US credit card market and showed that there was this mismatch between the people who wanted to borrow and the people who banks wanted to lend to. So they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. You know, we were lucky to have a graphic artist for The Economist try and depict our paper in a picture. And so here's the pictorial version of our paper, a banker extending money to the person who doesn't want it. So thank you so much, and looking forward to chatting to many of you during the panel discussion.